This is Identity at the Center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jim McDonald. I'm here today with Dan Moore. He's the Senior Director of CIAM Strategy and Identity Standards over at FusionAuth. And hey, this is a sponsor spotlight. It's a fully sponsored episode where we take a deep dive into our sponsor solutions and perspectives on the IAM market, and it's straight from the source. So we're going to have a lot of good conversation today with Dan. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Good to be here. Thanks for having me, Jim.
Yeah, we're really glad to have you. And this is a conversation I've been looking forward to for a long time. I'd like to I'd like to start with a question pretty much around what FusionAuth does. And the joke that I was thinking of was like, well, we could take from your name that you do something with auth, right? So is it authentication, authorization? Tell us about FusionAuth. What is it you guys do, and maybe a little backstory of the company?
Yeah, I mean, it's either authentication or it's something to do with like nuclear power, right? Like with that kind of name. We are a customer identity and access management system, which means that we focus on authentication and authorization. But instead of a lot of the folks that come on this podcast, which are focused on workforce or employee identity and access management, we focus on customers. And we started in about 2018. We actually had a rebrand. We grew out of another product that actually instantly failed. But we started in 2018 and then grew bootstrapped until 2023. And then we took some investment. And our perspective around customer identity access management is really that we find that people treat that as kind of a utility. They pick a vendor or they build it themselves and forget about it until renewal time. But we found that we think, and we've seen this over and over again, that identity is critical infrastructure. I don't have to sell that to you. You know that identity is critical infrastructure, but that means that control isn't optional. And so you need to own where you deploy, you need to own when you upgrade, and you need to own your data. And that's something that we really feel strongly at FusionAuth.
Yeah, I mean, that totally makes sense. I'm sure that whole piece about maintaining control resonates with a lot of our listeners. We do have a lot of listeners who either do only customer IAM or customer IAM as a part of their responsibility. Dan, this is your first time on the podcast, and it would not be an Identity at the Center podcast if we didn't hear a little bit about your identity origin story. So I posed a question to you. How did you get into identity? Did it choose you, or did you choose it?
I've been circling around identity for a long time. I've been a developer since the early 2000s. And I remember I did an internship in college where I ran a cracking program against a Unix password file for my employer to help increase the security of their login system. And I remember a little while later, I rolled my own auth for a small book review application that I wrote. So I kind of always had some identity inklings, but really started to get into identity in early 2020 when I joined FusionAuth as a developer relations engineer. And one of the things you do as a DevRel is you're explaining complicated concepts to developers and to engineers. And the more I dug in, the deeper the rabbit hole went around identity and authentication. It seems like such a simple thing, like how do you know somebody is who they say they are? But turns out there's a whole lot in that statement.
Yeah, you said something interesting there. So you talked about developer relations, and I think in my mind, when I think of FusionAuth, I think of this as a product that attracts the attention of developers. Is that true? I mean, is that just kind of a side benefit?
No, I think that that's definitely where we started, and where most of our customer base and community is from, is the developer side of things, as opposed to kind of the IT or the security side of things. Not that we don't have conversations with those people, but really our founder was a developer. a lot of the early employees were developers, and there's a developer ethos throughout the product and the company in terms of, you know, there are things that developers care about that I think that other people might downplay, and that could be extension points. It could be APIs that feel good, that are consistent. It could be extreme levels of customization, and that control aspect that I mentioned earlier. That I think is something that developers really care about, because at the end of the day, they're on the hook, right? And they're bringing our solution in, but they're still the ones that are responsible for making sure that the integration goes well and the application keeps running after they've done that integration.
Yeah, I think, Dan, there's so many different angles to this whole thing in authentication. Like, developers have a clear stake, especially on the CIAM side, because they're usually building an application. They need to take this authentication problem and solve it, whatever that means, according to the requirements of the company that they're working for, or the organization. Um, there's also stakeholders, as you mentioned, IT and information security. I think a lot of people think about authentication as a security requirement. But there's also the people who tend to control the budget, right? They're thinking about outcomes. And I know you've talked a lot about, thinking about authentication from an outcome perspective. And I think authentication can become an accelerator or a hindrance if you don't do it right for the business. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I don't want to forget. I want to add a very important stakeholder, especially for customer identity and access management, is the marketing team, right, or the sales team. Like, they're very interested in making sure that authentication doesn't overly impact what they're trying to do for the company, right, which is bring in new business, bring in new customers, and keep customers happy. And the way I think about this is that authentication is the front door to the application, and especially, again, for customers. And what do you think about when you think about front doors? Well, first of all, you want to make sure that you pick the front door that works for you. You want to make sure it's secure, it has a key that lets people in who should, and doesn't let people in who shouldn't be there. That it opens correctly, right? No one wants a door that sticks or has a lot of friction. You want to make sure it's the right size and it matches the home. And this, I think, is a key piece of the customer identity and access management story, is that a castle has a different front door than a tiny home. And so you need to make sure that you get the front door that fits your application, that is customizable, that has the workflows that you need it to have, that is extensible. And, as far as, the barrier aspect of that, you want to think about, and again, this is a spectrum, because I think that someone that is working on like an online game with a low cost of goods sold and a very easy sign-up process, or a goal of easy sign-up process, is different than someone who's trying to onboard doctors, where they're handling PII and HIPAA, if you're in the US, HIPAA rules and things like that. So at the end of the day, you want to include, the authentication features that your user population needs, whether that's linking to external directories using SAML or OIDC, offering frictionless social login or one-time passwords. Progressive registration is another thing that we see a lot of. And then I think intelligently challenging, that's a mouthful, intelligently challenging for MFA is something that is also on that security usability spectrum. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think that's really important for a application to not just blindly challenge for MFA after a certain period of time, but to actually look at all the signals that come in and be able to say, well, this matches what Dan has done for the past N times, or this account is really old, therefore there's some risk there, and increase the friction of login just at the point when it makes sense from a security perspective, so that you get that conversion and that path through the front door as smooth as possible.
You mentioned so much there that I I wanna come back to the identity standards piece because you brought up SAML, OIDC, OAuth. I wanna put those to the side for the moment and stick to this balance of friction and usability, and I think this is, like, from an information security perspective, we always used to say you turn one up and the other goes down, vice versa, right? You want to make it easier, security comes down, or if you add friction, potentially you can increase security. I think there's some truth to that, but I one of the things we were talking about is like, what are some of the common mistakes that people make in terms of, deploying their authentication flows, and adding friction that maybe isn't necessary?
Yeah, a very common one we see is people asking for too much information on registration. So that's where, and I totally get it from a perspective of wanting to know your customer. But I think that's where a progressive registration flow can really be helpful, where you ask for the minimum to get the people in the door that makes you sure that they're going to be a possible customer. And whether that's, having a verified email address or a company email, we see that a lot, or, you know, asking for just a first name and not a full name. And then later, as they get into your application, asking for more information at certain points after they've seen the value of the application. Another kind of piece of friction, I think, is not offering as many login options as users are want to desire. So, what does that mean? That means offering social login, but please don't only offer social login. I understand the desire to offload the security of the user's identity to a Google or a Facebook or a LinkedIn, but lots of people. Or actually, I should take a step back here. You need to know what your population wants, right? So that includes talking to customers, talking to potential customers. Again, going back to the example of the game versus the doctor's office or the doctors, the people who are signing up for the game may want Facebook login. They may need Facebook login. The people who are signing up for the doctor's offices may want passwords, or they may want to use passkeys. And so I think not understanding the login method that you want to offer, that your customers want to use, is a source of friction, and that causes kind of unnecessary um, obstacles that probably don't really increase security.
So Dan, I just had like a thought there. You mentioned know your customer, right? You've mentioned a few compliant regulatory frameworks that certain companies and certain industries need to follow, right? Like know your customer, HIPAA. If you are a bank or you are a hospital and you're in this using this progressive profiling approach that you kind of referred to, and you know it later down the road, if this person opens an account or if this person becomes a patient, we're no longer going to be able to accept as the authentication, right? At that point, we're going to make them create an identity with us and put it in our database, etc. Is it okay to start out with the Google authentication as an early stage in the authentication or early stage of progressive profiling? Or do you need to say, all right, well, we need to start off the way we want to finish up?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I will say everybody's case differs, right? So I want to be careful to offer blanket advice, but I think that um, it does depend on what you're gathering, and I think there's probably a checkpoint that you hit where now you need to start having a real identity in a way that like a Google login might not really offer. I'm not super familiar with the banking kind of KYC regulations, but I think that checkpoint would probably be pretty early if you were like opening an account in an online bank. Whereas if you're just entering a raffle and the bank wants to kind of have your information so they can send you a toaster. Do banks even do that anymore? They can send you like a free Amazon gift card. Then in that case, I'd say, go with the Google login right away, right? And then they can start to market to you and hopefully get you to come in or get you to go to their online system and open a bank account. At that point, that'd be the checkpoint where you're probably needing to produce government identification or some other way that they really can know who you are.
I see what your point is, right? You're talking a lot about having the flexibility, having a tool that supports the flexibility so you can create the progressive profiling workflow that makes sense for your organization. Um, and I think that has a lot to do with your story around customization. And I'm wondering if there are certain industries or use cases where customization, you see it kind of becoming more and more important, or it's just more important than the average.
Yeah, and I think you can kind of take a step back and think about like the different kinds of customization. There's workflow customization, which is where you can kind of create your registration experience or your login experience in the way that you want it to be. There's look and feel customization, which I think is an important aspect customization, especially for B2C type of experiences. Back to the front door analogy, for some people, it's more important that their front door kind of is cohesive with the whole house, as opposed to other people might not care if it looks a little different, a little off. And certainly in e-commerce or retail scenarios, it's really important that it's part of the same experience. And then there's integration customization, where we know that identity is, especially in the CIAM space, is one component of your application, but it's certainly not the whole thing. And so just like a database or a message queue needs to fit into your application and be configurable in the same way, possibly be deployable in the same infrastructure, lots of people think that way about their identity system too. They want to snap that in and customize how they operate it to fit their business's needs, as opposed to, um, having to work around what a SaaS solution might offer.
Yeah, and I'm sure that resonates with a lot of our listeners is like this ability to customize because we don't know what the use case is going to be until we sit down with the business. And it seems to me like you guys have designed FusionAuth so that um, you can fit a lot of different scenarios, or you have the ability that you can solve regardless of how the business wants to go about something like progressively challenging and progressive profiling of your user. Would you say that that is kind of what makes your solution stand apart from your competition?
I think there's a couple of different ways we stand apart from our competition. Yeah, as we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, I think if you're an engineering-led organization and you need enterprise authentication and features without lock-in or architectural constraints, FusionAuth is a really good fit. I just looked at kind of our existing customer list and kind of did an overview of why people pick us. And it's when they need control, that could be data isolation or deployment sovereignty. We haven't talked yet, but FusionAuth is self-deployable. So you can either pay us to run it for you, or you can run it yourself in your own environment. You might need some of that flexibility we talked about, which is basically be the ability to both call out and pull data into FusionAuth, or to push data from FusionAuth out into your systems. Um, we're really big about predictability. We actually have a transparent pricing page, and we don't lock you in. If you want your entire database of, if we're running FusionAuth for you, if you want your entire database of users, not regularly, but like because you're migrating off, we will 100% give that to you. You own your customer data. We're holding it in custody for you, not holding it hostage. And then the speed of deployment. I think that this does vary on the complexity of the situation, but we've definitely had people who've integrated their application with FusionAuth in a week. That was, I don't want to say that was the simplest situation. They actually had some external pressures, mostly budgetary, that caused that kind of rapid turnaround. But we've also had people that are working on projects that are complicated enough, they've taken years to kind of migrate their user base kind of bit by bit to FusionAuth.
So speaking of that, like the differentiation and why customers end up choosing you guys, um, what types of organizations, if there is a type, tend to be your sweet spot?
Yeah, I did a survey of our customers. I looked into our customer base a while ago, and it did really range from people that are using us even to manage their internal employee directory to very large B2C organizations and B2B organizations. Um, I think are some of the things that would cause someone to want to look at FusionAuth are people that are replacing a legacy auth system or a homegrown auth system, and they want minimal migration interruption. We have a lot of features that kind of can help with that situation. Another issue is when people want lightweight multi-tenancy but they still want that deployment flexibility. So within FusionAuth, it is what we call a single tenant solution. You're going to run it yourself. It's an independent database. Whether you run it yourself or we run it for you, it's an independent database. But within that database, you can have thousands of tenants, and we definitely have people that have split up their user pools to have thousands or tens of thousands of tenants. And kind of another big piece is, again, that balance between security friction and user experience. We provide a lot of tools that let you pick where is the right solution for your user base.
It feels to me like FusionAuth is, lined up, is it's the sweet spot for certain types of organizations that want to maintain control. And I think, like, look, I've been doing CIAM since 2003, right? That's how I got my entry into identity. And that control was never a question back then because there was no cloud. And then there was a period where everything started to move to the cloud. And I was in banking at the time,
Yeah.
and banks didn't want to put their data in the cloud. And I think that at some point they said, well, we can't really use um, a lot of the technology that's available unless we're willing to put things in the cloud. But there are still probably organizations that are doing everything to resist putting all their customer data in the cloud. So it seems to me this is a very important lane for certain organizations that want to maintain some level of control. And I didn't go through all that to bash putting things in the cloud. I think that there's a lot of benefit to that. But if there are certain levels of control that you want to maintain, you don't want to have a dependency on a vendor to run your infrastructure or have your data in a database that it gets mixed with other customer data, right? I mean, that seems to be the key differentiator you were talking about, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a key differentiator. It is worth kind of laying out that we have plenty of people that run FusionAuth in the cloud, and FusionAuth Cloud itself is on AWS. So we're big believers in the cloud. I think that you kind of have, again, another spectrum, right? You have on the far side kind of the pure play SaaS identity vendors where you don't have any operational burden at all, and you've given up a lot of that control. And then you have FusionAuth Cloud where you have given up some operational control, but we still let you do things like, for instance, control your upgrade cycle. Like we will never make you upgrade at the drop of a hat, and you get to control which version you're on, which is really nice for those developers who are the ones getting the on-call pages in the middle of the night because they can kind of have exact control of their environment. And then you have further levels of control, but also more responsibility where you are actually operating a tool like FusionAuth yourself. And so you can kind of think of that spectrum the same way you think about it for RDS, right? If you're in the database world, you might think of a fully managed database like a DynamoDB. Sorry, I used to teach for AWS. I used to teach AWS certification, so that's kind of what I reached to. But you have DynamoDB, which is fully managed, and then you have RDS, which is a lot managed, but you get control versions, and then you have like, I'm going to run Postgres in my data center. And I'm not going to pretend that any of those is 100% the right solution for everybody all the time. They just aren't, but they give you different levels. And I think it's good for the customers and the developers that are building these applications to be able to, look at their architecture, look at their reliability needs, look at their latency needs, look at their, how far they're going to be pushing their authentication solution, and see what makes sense.
You said a lot there. One, I am also AWS certified, and I was really surprised how difficult those exams were. There's a ton of resources on YouTube that make it easier, but I don't like doing those kind of things. I kind of feel like that's cheating. I think overall, I have this core belief when it comes to CIAM, especially, that it's not one size fits all. And you just kind of gave a lot of those reasons. And I've been involved with organizations when it comes to CIAM where it's like, hey, we want this to act a lot like authentication in our enterprise. But then when they, maybe that's a stakeholder from IT or from InfoSec. And then when you get to talk to marketing and they say, well, all this product lets us do is like change a little logo in the upper left-hand corner of the login screen. Like, no way. We want a fully branded experience. We want white box, and that, or white label. Sorry, we want white label, and we want to brand the heck out of this thing. And it's not just branding, but it's probably more than that, especially when it comes to building custom workflows. But I think this is the real trade-off between customizability and kind of out of the box, like, hey, we can completely replace our authentication system in a half an hour. Like, there's a trade-off there, right? Can you talk a little bit about that trade-off?
Yeah, I think that it gets back to the control versus responsibility trade-off that we talked about, right? The more control you have, the more responsibility you have. And so we have kind of three options for customizability around look and feel. The first is you can use our APIs, which our own kind of front end uses, and build your own experience, knowing that those APIs are going to continue to be supported for years and years. Obviously, that's a lot of responsibility to take, right? The second is you can use our simple themes, which let you do more than just replace a logo, but it is kind of a limited set, right? You can replace a logo, you can change the color scheme, you can change kind of some of the wording, a lot of the wording actually, but there's it's kind of a simple path. And then there's our advanced themes, which let you tear down the entire look and feel. You're still kind of in our workflows, but you can basically replace every bit of HTML, every bit of JavaScript, every bit of CSS. And we definitely have people who are in all three of those buckets. And I think probably the things that indicate whether or not which bucket they'll fall into, it's a combination of their engineering team capacity, because a big reason that you pick a CIAM provider is you want to offload some of the engineering effort to a vendor who will continue to push your authentication experience forward. And our integrations, especially if you choose one of the more kind of customizable one, it takes some time to do some integration, but then after that, it decreases a lot. I think then the desire of control that they have from one of their stakeholders, right? It could be marketing, it could be legal and compliance. Those definitely weigh in. But I think that it also depends on the business you're in. To be totally blunt, like something that is a kind of a B2B to C SaaS offering where you're selling to an admin who will basically hook up your directory and let all your employees have access. I mean, they still need a good customer experience, but it's not quite, doesn't need to be as high fidelity as somebody like Little Caesars, who's one of our customers, that they really want to make sure that login experience is core because it is, right in the path to revenue.
Yeah, I've been focusing on the differences, but there are some common threads, and you just kind of talked about them. There's the B2B where customers are selling to other businesses. So it's a business selling to a business. There's also the B2B2C where they're selling to a customer, but then I'm sorry, they're selling to a business, but the business is selling to an end user, right? There's these common use cases, and I'd like to pick on that even a little bit more and say, what are some of the common challenges that organizations face across all these different spectrums?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think a common challenge is that again, back to kind of the very first bit of conversation we had, they want to make sure that the door is secure and that it also looks good. And so they are trying to pick where that right space is on that continuum. That's a common challenge. I think making sure that the door is always open, that it's highly available is an important thing, whether you're in B2B to C or in B2B or in B2C. Um, I think that offloading some of the cognitive load of the identity standards and making sure that things are compatible is an important one. And I think finally, I think just generally a security posture, right? PII fines if they leak, if there's a breach, can be substantial and damaging, not just in terms of financial reputation, but also in terms of organizational rep. And so I think those are some of the main things that are cross-cutting concerns.
Yeah, I think those are important. So we talked about what's common. We talked about the ability to differentiate. And then I think going back to this customer evaluation scenario, I've actually seen some organizations where they say build versus buy, right? And so they almost have to get past that hurdle. Look, early in my IT career, it was always build versus buy. And then it got to the point where it's like, okay, you could just skip past that. What are you going to buy? But I think when it comes to CIAM, especially, you still have to ask the question build versus buy, especially when you've got talented developers. Why did they decide to buy versus build?
Yeah, I think that AI is decreasing the cost of build to some extent as well, right? That's a new kind of factor in the last couple of years. But I think that it's really an opportunity cost story. And it is what is core to your business and what is not core to your business. And I think this is to tie this back into one of the previous threads. This is where the control spectrum matters too, because you could argue that actually making sure that someone can log in is core to your business. And I totally have sympathy for that. I also think that you could argue that it is not core to business because it is undifferentiated. I don't think I've ever heard anybody say, "Oh, I love this application X because it's got such an awesome logging experience." I've got news for you folks. As much as Jim and I love identity, most of your users just want to get through the login process to get to the good stuff, right? To get to your functionality, your data, whatever your application has that is, the thing that they signed up for. So the reason that that's important is or again, that's another reason why we have this. We think that deployment flexibility is so important is because it lets you take over the operational control of your identity system, which again, you want to make sure that you're the one on the hook for the paging. You want to make sure that you can control making sure it's available while handing off the feature control. What do I mean by feature control? That's choosing to implement passkeys. That's making sure that you're up to date with the latest versions of the standards. It's making sure that you're able to turn on a feature like MFA by checking a box as opposed to, or making an API call as opposed to building it out yourself. And so I think that these are all things that are important.
I think there are certain big tech examples where they kind of have to have their own authentication platform because they're basically selling authentication, or if you're Google, right, you're not going to have a product. But I think organizations have to be careful in terms of classifying themselves as big tech. You could be big tech and still not have to run your own authentication or identity platform, right? And so I think that is one of the things. I want to go back to something you talked about earlier, Dan, which is you very quickly mentioned APIs. And when we got into this conversation about big tech, I started to think about um, kind of this omni-channel experience where you have a lot of streaming platforms now. So you have to authenticate with a TV, or you have to authenticate on different types of devices, including things like kiosks and things like that. So you might be facing the unknown, but if they can understand the language, and this is also segueing into standards a little bit in terms of if you have a platform that can run on web standards and you can do RESTful API, then you guys can solve that problem, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think that the multi-form factor is something that we're definitely seeing a lot of nowadays. Um, Oftentimes, it's kind of web and mobile. Those are kind of obviously the two big ones in terms of where the customers are. But we have people running FusionAuth in kiosks. We have a solution for devices that don't have a great user input screen, like a fridge or a TV. FusionAuth is actually running and supporting satellites running in space. So I think that, and to take a step back, I think that that omni-channel experience that you mentioned is a great reason for a separate CIAM server, right? When you have uh, N different applications and you want your user to be able to single sign on into them, but you also want your marketing team to have one view of that user, that is a really powerful experience as opposed to a bunch of different applications that have siloed user data stores. And we actually see that from some of our customers. They come in and they want to have a unified user data store. And we can talk, if you want, about some of the techniques that you would use to start to bring those user data stores together. It's a complicated problem, and that is to echo something we said earlier, that is more likely to take months or years than a single application that you're kind of swapping out one identity store for another. But yeah, to get back to your original question, I do think that being able to support devices in multiple modalities is a great use of a CIAM system. And to take a step back finally, that's really, again, where CIAM is different than workforce IAM in that you need to meet your customers where they are. We talked earlier about social login or other kind of solutions to meet your customer where they are. Meeting them on the device that they are on is another way that you can extend your reach and make your customers happy.
Yeah, I think the role of a developer a lot of times is like taking all the elements together and assembling them into kind of this killer app or killer set of apps. It's not, hey, I'm a developer. I actually have to build my own this, that, and the other. I have to be completely vertical and everything. It's the assembly of all these things. It's almost like, to use your Little Caesars example, like building the perfect pizza doesn't mean you have to have a dairy farm to make your own
Right,
cheese, right?
right.
So, I think that was just a thought that came to my head. And I think on top of that, especially in this identity space, you already talked about it, the identity standards. And, throughout my career, these kind of things have built. And I've grown to really appreciate standards because it it's the only thing that you have to help you avoid vendor lock-in. So from the perspective of a practitioner, that's what's important to me. Um, we also talked about this omni-channel experience. Is there anything else that you could tie? In other words, why are you guys so jazzed about identity standards and make it such a core part of your message?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you kind of hit one of the key points, which is they avoid vendor lock-in and or I should be careful here because standards always have some white space. And so I don't want anyone to listen to this conversation and say, oh, if I just choose a vendor, then I will 100% be able to move over to any other vendor with like zero friction. That's just not the case. But they do give you a hope or a greater ability to avoid vendor lock-in. And the other reason why we love standards at FusionAuth is that they let you stand on the shoulder of giants and avoid the mistakes of the past. And I've been following the OS specification for years and have seen, something will be discovered and then a new standard or a new aspect of a standard will be improved. And guess what? By buying from a vendor who supports standards, you're basically gaining all the knowledge of all those mistakes and all the fixes for those mistakes that have been happening over the last 10, 15, 20 years. I think Pixie is a great example of that. The proof key for code exchange, solved a certain problem, and especially in the mobile world, and you get all the benefit of that by just choosing a vendor who supports that, as opposed to kind of discovering that yourself if you roll it yourself or if you choose a vendor that isn't really standards based.
So I want to ask more or less a future facing question around where the consumer authentication experience is heading. Um, I think MFA has been available, but MFA is, a lot of times, even for banking systems, like we'll send you an SMS text or things like that. Where do you see it heading? I know you guys are working on some innovations here when it comes to MFA.
Yeah, I think that we're going to see more and more risk-based authentication and risk-based MFA and risk-based registration, where it's not just, you've MFA'd once on this device, and so you're good for 10 days or some configurable number of days. It's going to be what is happening around this authentication event that we can ask the system for, or we can examine about the user that we're trying to authenticate without asking the user for something else. That's the issue with MFA. I love MFA. My wife hates it, but it's additional things that you're asking of the user, but you also know how old that user's account is. You know the last time they logged in. You know the last time their password changed. You know the last time that their login identifier might have been modified. You know what IP address they're coming from. You have all these signals, and so that is a really important thing to incorporate into your decision-making process. And that doesn't mean that you should 100% deny a login that maybe looks a little weird, because the unfortunate thing about all those signals is none of them are deterministic, right? It is possible that I might be logging in on a VPN that makes it look like I'm 1,000 miles away from where I logged in this morning. So you don't want to totally block someone out, but that is the perfect time to introduce some more friction. And so we actually have a feature that is coming out in the next couple of weeks that is going to incorporate all these risk signals into an MFA challenge situation. So that, and again, back to the point I made earlier, FusionAuth is all about giving developers control. We're not going to say you have to use this intelligent MFA, but will be something that you can enable on a tenant by tenant or application by application basis for the applications that you want to change where you are on that spectrum between usability and security.
So Dan, one more question on this. So we're talking. You just went over a lot of the features that you guys have in the works that you're going to be releasing soon. I spend a lot of time thinking about, a couple years down the road, and I feel like we're in one of the times where it's the hardest to imagine what things are going to be like 3 years from now, especially with AI. I think of like AI agents and what could potentially become of them, me sending them off to do work on my behalf, go and find, hey, I want to buy these hiking boots, go off and find the best deal for me and then purchase them when you find that best deal. Um, that's kind of, like when I put my future facing cap on where I could see customer I am going in the future. I'm kind of wondering from your perspective, thinking, let's throw a number out there, 3 years out, what are the things that, are really in your mind and you're starting as a strategist to plan around?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI agents are obviously a huge one. I will say I think that AI agents in the format that you've kind of laid out are much more of a customer identity and access management problem than they are an IAM problem, because you're going to have, um, you know, people that are driving these that are not your employees that you're trying to provide services to and make money from. So what does that mean? That means that um, I would not be surprised if the agentic, like kind of primary agent in my in my shoes as a customer is something that's embedded in a device, right? If I was Apple or Microsoft or Google, I would be trying to build this agentic functionality into my phone or my computer as fast as I possibly could. And so, what does that mean from a kind of a CIAM vendor perspective? Well, I think you need to be able to be discovered and be able to be interacted with by these agents. And that means supporting the standards that are emerging. And model context protocol is obviously one of these. We actually have some customers that are starting to roll that out for not just their internal employees, but for their customers to start to interact with their systems. And there are some other ones out there too. And I guess I would say that 3 years is not that long a period of time in the standards world. One of the very first articles I wrote for FusionAuth was something about OAuth 2.1. And I think I might have written in that article, and it should be done in the next 6 to 8 months. And OAuth 2.1 is still a draft standard. It has not yet been kind of blessed and kind of moved through to be a full RFC. So I think I had my eyes open a little bit in terms of how long it takes. The benefit of that, of course, is that it can adjust over time, and as things change, it's not locked in. So, and standards are best when they're they're implemented in multiple different ways by multiple different vendors and practitioners, because then you're sure that it's not just someone taking their bespoke process and stamping it with a standard. But to get back to your final your question, like, I think agents are going to be big. I honestly, and I feel weird saying this, but I think passwords will still be around. I think for some subset of people, passwords
No,
are.
no.
I know, but it's very hard to think of things that are as portable and can be as. I mean, you can make a really long secure password, and it has some benefits, and also, frankly, it's like a lowest common denominator for sure, right? It works across any device, any form factor, etc. Yeah, I think those are kind of the two main prognostications I would make.
Dan, really appreciate all the time you've given us today. I mean, I've learned a lot. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot and probably are interested in now learning more about FusionAuth. I'd like to know, well, first off, I know you set up a URL for us at fusionauth.io/IDAC. Correct me if I got that wrong. So
That is correct.
fusionauth.io/IDAC, get more information. But any kind of parting thoughts on, why people should check out FusionAuth, especially if they're looking for a new solution or, just generally anything to close out on the technology topic?
Yeah. So I think that the same way that you are going to want to partner with a vendor when it comes to the cloud provider that you pick or a key part of your application, like a database or a messaging library, message queue, excuse me, you want to pick a vendor with a CIAM vendor with the same level of care, like do the POC, kick the tires. And I think that when you're, as a developer, implementing a CIAM system, which again is the front door to your application, you're partnering with that authentication provider. It's not something that you can outsource. This is not a widget you're putting on your website that's like a chatbot that you can switch out very easily. Um, we talked about AWS a little bit. It's similar to the AWS shared responsibility. The best authentication and most secure MFA in a customer identity access management system doesn't work if the application is not checking the token at the end of the day, right? Verifying the signature or all the other things you need to do with the token. FIFA had a hack about this, which I'm happy to share with you. But so at the end of the day, treat it like an engineering problem and think about who you want as a partner is the thing that I would leave everyone with when we were talking about CIAM systems.
That sounds awesome. So yeah, that FISA link that you mentioned, shoot that over to me, Dan. We'll drop it in the show notes. Um, it's part of the Identity at Center podcast tradition that we ask something, we end on a lighter note. So we've had all this fantastic technical conversation for the last 50 minutes. I wanted to ask you, like, we're right in the heat of the summer. Everyone's going on vacation somewhere cool. Are you going anywhere?
Yeah, me and my family are gonna get up to Seattle in the Pacific Northwest in August. Looking forward to, I don't know, I went to school up in Washington State, and summers in Seattle are the best. It's so much sun, it's so much green, and we're gonna do some stuff on Lake Washington and maybe see the Space Needle. And I'm looking forward to that a lot. Do you have any vacations planned, Jim?
Yeah, I'm going further northwest. So, on July 4th for that weekend and the week after, we're heading up to Alaska. And it's been like on the bucket list forever. Starting in Anchorage, going to Seward, going to Homer, then
Mm,
back to Anchorage. So I'm super excited, man. This year got a chance to go to Europe. I've been to Las Vegas. So why not Alaska, right? It just the theme
Europe,
seems to be
Vegas.
like just whatever, every kind of vacation. So, yeah, I'm excited about that. And by the way, I have been to Washington State and Oregon. Those are next to Ireland, the greenest
Mm,
places I've ever been.
yeah.
I remember going to Ireland the first time, and they call it the Emerald Isle, and you can really see why when you get there. It's like green, 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 and it's like a
Definitely.
bright green. What I found in the Pacific Northwest is like every tree has like moss or vines growing on it. So it's like not only are the leaves green, but the entire tree is green, and there's moss growing on everything because of probably the water, the humidity in the air. It's kind of humid. I lived in the Southeast for 20 years, so
Mm,
the only thing that I think is more humid, well, was Florida. Florida is
yeah.
like super humid, and Mexico, and there are places that are more humid, but I got used to it.
Yeah, yeah. The Northwest is nice because you have that humidity and that rain and that drizzle for 9 months out of the year. And then I don't know whether it's May or June, but there's this moment that comes and bam, it's like the sun's out and you get those long days. And we're really looking forward to that vacation for sure.
That's awesome, man. I hope you have a great time on your vacation. And I'm going to go ahead and close this one out. Dan, thank you so much for your time. Uh, I'd encourage everyone to get out to fusionauth.io/IDAC, learn more about the product. We'll put Dan's LinkedIn information in the show notes so you can reach out to him, connect, start a conversation. And of course, we're always at idacpodcast.com. idacpodcast.tv brings you right to our YouTube channel. And we appreciate everyone who listens to the show. Thank you. We do this for you. Hopefully this is information that is educational and entertaining, and we'll keep doing it. So for now, I say goodbye, and we'll talk to you all on the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.